What hidden flame can endure in silence, shaping a life so quietly that its brilliance is only discovered after death? Good evening, dear friends, wherever you are listening tonight. Settle into your favorite quiet place, breathe gently, and join our peaceful community. Please remember to subscribe before the story begins. This is the life of Saint Charbel, a humble hermit whose hidden suffering, unwavering devotion, and mysterious grace transformed silent sacrifice into a radiant legacy that continues to console, heal, and inspire countless souls across generations and distant lands today. And so, before the world ever knew his name, a child was born in the snow-covered village of Kafra, a place where winter winds could carve silence into the very stone of the mountains, and where faith was woven into the rhythm of daily life. In this high and rugged corner of Lebanon, where the cedar forests stood like ancient guardians and the cold air carried the scent of prayer from humble homes, Charbel entered the world in 1828, one small life wrapped in the vastness of God's creation. His parents, simple and devout Maronite Christians, welcomed him with joyful hearts, unaware that this quiet child would one day become a beacon to countless souls seeking healing and hope. In those days, Kafra was a place of hard labor and simple comforts, where families woke before dawn to tend their land and ended each day gathered around the warmth of candlelight, whispering prayers for strength and protection. It was in such an atmosphere that young Youssef, the boy who would become Saint Charbel, first learned that suffering and love often live side by side, shaping a life long before its purpose is known. From his earliest years, the child sensed the world through a lens of wonder and quiet attentiveness. While other children filled the village paths with laughter and play, he often slipped away to sit beneath a towering cedar or wander along the mountain slopes, listening to the wind as though it carried a voice meant only for him. There was something in his demeanor, even then, that hinted at a deeper calling, a profound stillness that seemed older than his years. Neighbors would sometimes watch him from afar, his small figure outlined against the vast horizon, and remark on the unusual calm that followed him like a gentle shadow. Though he spoke little, his silence felt full, as if the mountains themselves had lent him their patient strength. In his mother's embrace, he was tender and attentive, yet within his young heart a quiet longing stirred, drawing him toward the sacred in ways even he could not fully understand. Yet childhood, for him, was not untouched by sorrow. The early death of his father left his mother to raise the family alone, and the burden of loss pressed heavily upon their home. In the dim light of their modest dwelling, young Youssef watched her pray with a faith that did not falter, even as tears sometimes slipped down her cheeks. Her whispered prayers, offered in both grief and trust, became the first schooling of his soul. He learned not from grand teachings, but from the simple witness of a mother who held suffering and hope together in the same trembling hands. Perhaps it was here, within the quiet ache of loss, that the seed of his future solitude was planted. For in every moment of hardship, he saw how the human heart could lean upon God and find enough light to move through one more day. This awareness, tender and deep, shaped him long before he knew the shape of his own vocation. As the seasons passed and he grew, the village chapel became his refuge. The flickering candles, the scent of incense, the soft murmurs of evening prayers, these became as familiar to him as the mountain paths. He would slip into the small sanctuary with a reverence that surprised the elders, kneeling in silent contemplation for long moments that stretched into hours. Some wondered if a child could truly grasp the mystery that held him so still, but others sensed that the longing within him was not easily explained. It was as though he carried a quiet invitation from heaven, a gentle pull that wove itself into his spirit with each passing day. Even in the simple tasks of village life, helping his uncle, tending animals, gathering wood, there was a grace in his movements, an inner gaze that never quite left the realm of prayer. In these early years, the contours of his future path were drawn not by dramatic events, but by the slow, steady shaping of a soul learning to listen. And how often, in the stories of saints, does true holiness begin in such hidden ways? How many lives are formed in the quiet places where no one is watching and only God sees the unfolding beauty? For young Yusef, the mountains were his first monastery, the cedar trees his first silent companions, and his mother's prayers his first lessons in trust. He did not yet know what life would ask of him, nor the depth of sacrifice that awaited, but the gentle foundations were already being laid. Stone upon stone, silence upon silence, faith upon faith. In time, the villagers would remember these beginnings with awe, recalling the boy who walked softly through their midst as if already attuned to a world beyond their own. But for now, he remained simply a child shaped by the rhythms of nature and the heartbeat of prayer, living in a home warmed by love and shadowed by loss, in a village perched close to heaven. In these quiet beginnings lay the seeds of a hidden journey that only time would reveal. From those early days of childhood, a strange but beautiful silence grew within him, a silence that did not push him away from the world, but instead pulled him gently into the depths of it. The people of Beka Kafra often saw young Yusef walking alone along the narrow paths that wound through the mountains, his small figure moving steadily between the rocks and cedars as if guided by an invisible hand. He rarely sought the company of other boys, though he never seemed lonely. Rather, he carried within him a quiet attentiveness, a peaceful gravity, a sense that each moment, each breeze, each bird song, each shaft of sunlight breaking through the clouds, held something worth listening to. Perhaps in these early wanderings, he was already learning the language of God, not through books or voices, but through the soft unfolding of creation itself. His favorite place was the village chapel, a modest stone building that smelled of incense and old wooden pews, its candles flickering against the cool darkness. While other children knelt quickly and hurried out again, Yusef lingered for long stretches, gazing at the crucifix with an absorption rare even among the elders. What thoughts moved through him in those moments? No one knew. But villagers sometimes stepped inside to find him motionless, his small hands folded, his face softened by a serenity that seemed far beyond his years. And when he finally rose from his prayer, it was with the unhurried stillness of one who had been listening deeply. His mother, who watched him with both tenderness and wonder, sensed that his heart was already being shaped by a presence she herself felt only in fleeting sparks during her hardest nights of prayer. Yet his devotion did not make him rigid or distant. There was a gentleness in him that drew people close. He helped his mother without being asked, carrying water, gathering wood, tending the animals with patience and care. When a neighbor fell ill, he quietly delivered food. When widows struggled with chores, he appeared at their doors. His acts were simple, but they came from a heart steady in its desire to ease burdens, to bring a little warmth where life had grown cold. Even as a boy, he revealed something of that hidden compassion that would later define the solitude of his hermitage. But for now, it showed itself in small, almost unnoticed acts, the kind that seldom make stories, yet are the first stones laid in a lifelong path of holiness. One day, while walking along the outskirts of the village, he discovered a small natural cave formed by two leaning rocks. Something about the narrow opening drew him, and he stepped inside. Light filtered gently through a crack above, scattering soft patterns on the ground. The air was cool, the space quiet, and he felt a calm settle around him. This place, humble as it was, became his secret chapel. Here he knelt for long stretches, whispering simple prayers, offering his small life to God with a sincerity that surprised even himself. At times he felt as though he were being watched, not with the eyes of people, but with the tender gaze of one who knew him completely. It was a refuge, a sanctuary of silence, and in that hidden place his longing deepened into something more than childish devotion. The seeds of a future hermit's life were quietly taking root. Though he rarely spoke of his inner experiences, his mother sensed that something momentous was unfolding within him. She sometimes found him staring out at the mountains in thoughtful stillness, as if pondering a question he could not yet express. She worried, as mothers do, desiring for him a strong future, a stable life, perhaps even a family of his own one day. But she also feared losing him, for she recognized in him the same longing for God that had moved saints throughout history, the kind of longing that leads a soul far from home, far from the comforts of ordinary life. In her prayers, she asked God to guide him, yet her heart trembled at the thought of what such guidance might require. As he grew, the quiet pull he felt toward solitude only strengthened. The village, though dear to him, began to feel increasingly like a place he occupied rather than a place that held him. Every day, after completing his chores, he slipped away to the chapel or his hidden cave, drawn to silence the way others were drawn to laughter or companionship. He loved his family and his village, yet his soul seemed to look beyond them, toward something vast and unspoken. He sensed it in the stillness of dawn, in the cold clarity of starlit nights, in the gentle whisper of pine branches swaying in the wind. Something called him, softly but persistently, like a distant bell whose sound deepened each time he listened. It was around this time that he began to encounter stories of saints and hermits, passed down through local tradition and told by traveling priests. These tales stirred something deep within him, the lives of men and women who gave themselves wholly to God, who embraced solitude and prayer, resonated with a familiarity he could not explain. It was as if he recognized something of his own future reflected in their paths. But he kept these feelings hidden, unsure of how to express them, unsure even if they were truly his or simply passing inspirations. Yet each story left a mark, lingering in the quiet spaces of his heart long after the words had faded. Nature itself seemed to nurture this inner formation. The mountains became both guide and companion, teaching him resilience, patience, and the value of stillness. In their shadow, he learned that God often speaks not with thunder, but with quiet persistence, shaping the soul as gradually as wind shapes stone. He learned that loneliness can become a doorway to presence, and that silence can awaken rather than diminish the heart. These lessons, carried lightly in childhood, would one day become the very foundation of his monastic life. Still, despite this growing inwardness, he was not detached from the sorrows of those around him. When hardship struck his family, he bore it with a maturity that surprised even his elders. When food ran scarce in the winter, he shared without hesitation. And when storms swept across the mountains, rattling the shutters and shaking the foundations of their home, He prayed not only for protection, but for courage to face whatever lay ahead. There was something in him that trusted deeply, even amid fear. His faith was not yet refined by sacrifice, nor tested by the trials that would one day come. But it was real, it was alive, and it quietly grew stronger with each passing season. If one were to watch him then, they might ask, what stirs the heart of a child to walk such a path? What unseen grace begins its work long before the world takes notice? Such questions dwell at the edges of mystery, for the formation of a saint often begins in the gentlest, smallest gestures, gestures that appear ordinary until time reveals the extraordinary depth that sustained them. And so it was with young Youssef, whose life unfolded quietly in the rhythms of mountain and chapel, family and solitude, prayer and hidden yearning. These early stirrings of devotion, though still fragile, prepared him for the first great turning point of his life, a choice that would require courage, sacrifice, and a trust larger than anything he had yet known. For as he approached young adulthood, the call that had whispered to him since childhood began to speak with a clarity he could no longer ignore. It awaited him just beyond the borders of the life he had always known, inviting him to follow the deepening pull of the silence he had come to love. But where does childhood devotion lead when the world's call grows louder? As the young boy became a young man, the time arrived for a choice that would shape his entire destiny, a choice that had been quietly forming within him through years of prayer, silence, and a longing that only deepened as he grew. The mountains of Beka Kafra had raised him well, teaching him to listen, to endure, to trust, but they could not answer the growing ache in his heart, the desire for a life lived wholly for God. With each passing day, he felt the gentle pull toward something beyond the familiar paths of his village, something that lay hidden behind the serene solitude he so often sought. The chapel that had once been a refuge for a quiet boy now felt like a doorway into a different future, urging him to step through. And although he tried to dismiss these stirrings as youthful dreams, the call persisted, steady and unmistakable, like the distant rhythm of a bell carried through the mountain air. His family sensed the shift within him long before he found the courage to speak of it. His mother noticed the way he lingered longer in prayer, how his forehead rested against the wooden pew with an intensity she had not seen before. His siblings observed how he drifted into silence even during meals, as though listening to a voice only his heart could hear. He was dutiful, kind, and helpful, yet something in him had turned inward, softening his presence while sharpening his purpose. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the shadows stretched across their modest home, he would gaze at the faint outline of the mountains beyond the window, as though searching for an answer hidden in their ancient slopes. His mother would watch him from a distance, torn between pride and fear, knowing that the heart of a child can belong to its mother for only so long before it must follow its own path. It was on a cool morning, wrapped in the hush of dawn, that he finally approached her. The village was still half asleep, the fog hanging low over the rooftops, and the scent of dew clinging to the air. His mother was grinding wheat when he stood before her, his hands folded, his face solemn yet peaceful. She looked up, and in that moment she knew what he would say before he said it. Still, she waited for the words, her heart trembling with the weight of a truth she both anticipated and dreaded. He spoke simply, without flourish or hesitation. He told her that he felt called to leave Beka Kafra and enter the monastery of Our Lady of Mefuk, to give his life entirely to God. His voice carried no uncertainty, only the steady conviction born from years of quiet listening. As the words settled between them, the air seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her hands remained still on the stone mill, and her eyes drifted from his face to the small window that framed the distant mountains. She had known this moment would come, yet knowing did not soften the ache. The thought of losing him, not to death, but to a life lived apart, fell upon her like a cold wind. He was her son, the gentle boy who had grown up under her care, who had carried water from the well and tended the land with her, who had comforted her in the long nights after her husband's death. Now he stood before her not as a child, but as a young man, ready to step into a life she could never share. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, for she understood that a mother's love sometimes means letting go when every part of her wants to hold tighter. She asked him only one question. Was he certain? He nodded, the quiet gravity in his expression answering more deeply than words could. She saw then that his choice had not come lightly. It had grown through years of sorrow and prayer, through long walks in the mountains and hours spent in silent contemplation. She knew she could not stand in the way of what God had begun in him, even if it meant her heart would carry a lifelong ache. And so, with a trembling voice and a strength born of faith, she gave him her blessing. It was a blessing soaked in tears she tried not to show, a blessing shaped by both love and sacrifice. For in releasing him, she was offering not just her son, but a piece of her own heart to the will of God. The day of his departure arrived with a stillness that seemed to echo through the village. Word had spread quietly, and neighbors gathered outside their homes to watch him pass, their expressions a mixture of pride and sorrow. He walked with gentle steps, carrying only what was necessary. His mother walked beside him for a time, her hand brushing his sleeve now and then, as if memorizing the feel of him before they parted. When they reached the small shrine just beyond the village, she stopped. This was the place where mothers often bid farewell to sons heading into the world, and tradition held that the shrine belonged to both endings and beginnings. She placed her hand on his cheek, her eyes shining with a love too deep for words. With one final embrace, soft, lingering, and filled with unspoken prayers, she released him. He continued alone, the path winding upward, the air crisp against his skin. Each step felt both weightless and heavy. Weightless because he knew he was walking toward his calling, heavy because he was walking away from everything he had ever known. He did not look back, not out of coldness but out of a deep desire to offer his entire heart to what lay ahead. If he turned, even for a moment, the pull of home might weaken his resolve. And so he walked with steady determination, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his soul anchored in the quiet conviction that God was leading him. The journey to the monastery was long and rugged, but he welcomed the hardship. The rocky slopes, the biting wind, the long stretches of solitude, all felt like companions preparing him for a life shaped by sacrifice and silence. As he approached Mefuk, the monastery rose gently from the landscape, its stone walls blending into the mountain like a natural extension of the earth. Bells tolled softly in the distance, and the scent of incense drifted through the air. It felt both foreign and strangely familiar, as if he had been walking toward this place his entire life. When he reached the monastery gate, he paused, letting the weight of the moment settle within him. A new life awaited beyond those walls, a life of obedience, prayer, and hidden labor, a life that would demand everything he had and more. Yet in his heart, a profound peace blossomed, steady and luminous. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold not as a boy unsure of his place, but as a young man offering himself fully to God. And thus, a single step away from home became a lifelong step toward God. The monastery welcomed him, yet its walls tested every fiber of his resolve. For life at Our Lady of Mefuk was far harsher than anything he had imagined on the mountain paths of Baka Kafra. From the moment he crossed the threshold, a strict and unspoken rhythm governed every hour: the rising bell before dawn, the long hours of labor, the silence that held the corridors like a steady breath, and the prayers that rose and fell like the tide of a hidden sea. For young Yusef, still tender in body and spirit, the days were long and the demands relentless. But he embraced each task with a steady, quiet willingness, never asking for rest or relief, never shrinking from hardship. Where others sometimes wavered, he bowed his head and moved forward with the same soft determination that had carried him through the rugged mountain slopes toward this very life. At Mefuk, he was confronted with the full reality of monastic discipline. The monks were kind but firm, shaping novices not with harshness, but with unwavering consistency. Each movement, each word, sometimes even each thought, was expected to serve God. There were no luxuries, no comforts, no allowances for fatigue. The robes were coarse, the meals simple, and the nights often cold enough that sleep offered little comfort. Yet Yusef did not complain. He rose with the bell, worked until his hands burned, prayed until his knees ached, and learned to silence the restless corners of his mind so that his soul might slowly take the shape of surrender. The simplicity of life at Mefuk stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only what could belong to God. His duties were humble and exhausting. He hauled water up steep paths, chopped wood in the biting chill of dawn, tilled fields hardened by the cold mountain air, and scrubbed the monastery floors until they reflected the lamplight like quiet pools. He learned to tend the animals, sweep the courtyards, prepare meals, and assist in the sacristy, where the sacred vessels were kept. No task was too small, and he performed each with the same reverence he brought to prayer. His fellow novices noticed his diligence and his silence, two qualities that made him stand out even among those who had arrived with great spiritual fervor. While some grew weary and questioned their calling, he remained steady, almost luminous in his perseverance. Yet beneath his calm exterior, there were moments when the life tested him deeply. There were nights when his muscles trembled with exhaustion, when cold seeped into his bones and seemed to settle there, unmoving. There were days when the silence felt vast and heavy, when he longed for the familiar sounds of his village, his mother's voice, or the warmth of home. Grief pressed quietly upon him on certain evenings, especially when the monks sat together in the refectory, their faces half lit by candlelight, their voices low and measured. At times, he felt the ache of separation so intensely that he wondered whether he had asked too much of his own heart. But he did not allow these thoughts to linger. Instead, he carried them to prayer, laying them at the foot of the altar like small offerings that God alone could transform. There were lessons he had not expected, too. Lessons in obedience that challenged his will more than any physical hardship. The monastery required not only outward discipline, but inward surrender, a relinquishing of one's desires, opinions, and expectations. When asked to redo a task he believed complete, he did so without hesitation. When corrected by elders, he bowed his head with humility, accepting guidance even when pride whispered for him to resist. When given difficult assignments or placed in situations designed to test patience, He moved through them with a quiet gentleness that impressed those around him. Slowly, the monks began to see in him a soul shaped by grace, not because he displayed extraordinary talents, but because he surrendered even the smallest parts of himself with sincerity. Despite the severity of life at Mayfuk, there were moments of profound beauty, moments that strengthened him, moments that whispered of God's nearness. The chanting of psalms at dawn, rising like incense into the pale morning light. The profound stillness of the chapel at night, where only the flickering glow of the tabernacle lamp broke the darkness. The camaraderie of brothers who, though bound to silence, shared a deep and unspoken unity. The sight of mist rolling down the mountains at dusk, as if the earth itself were praying alongside them. These glimpses of grace wove themselves into the fabric of his days, reminding him why he had come, why he remained, and why he would continue to walk the path before him. Over time, the monks noticed something quietly luminous about him. He did not seek recognition, yet his presence had a way of settling the space around him, of bringing stillness where there had been restlessness. He was obedient without becoming rigid, silent without becoming withdrawn, gentle without becoming fragile. His devotion was not marked by intensity but by steadiness, a steady flame that did not flicker even when the winds of fatigue or sorrow blew against it. The elders, seasoned in the ways of spiritual discernment, saw in him the seeds of a vocation that would one day bear extraordinary fruit, though none could yet imagine the magnitude of the light he would carry into the world. And yet, for all his growth, he remained deeply aware of his own smallness. He was not seeking greatness, nor did he imagine himself destined for anything beyond the quiet life of a monk. His heart was content simply to serve, to pray, to offer each day as a gift. He believed with simple sincerity that holiness did not require grand acts or dramatic gestures. It required faithfulness, steady, hidden, surrendered faithfulness, and this he offered with all he had. In these early years at Mayfuk, the foundations of his future sanctity were laid. The challenges that might have driven others away only intensified his longing for God. The austerities that might have hardened another heart only deepened his compassion. The silence that might have frightened others became his closest companion. By the time his period of formation drew to a close, the young man who had left Beka Kafra was no longer the same. His spirit had been shaped by discipline, his life rooted in prayer, his heart refined by surrender. Still, something within him deepened, like a flame learning to survive the wind. In time, his path carried him to Anaya, where the mountains seemed to rise like silent witnesses to his longing, their steep ridges shaped by centuries of wind and prayer. The transfer from the monastery of Mayfuk to the monastery of Saint Maron marked more than a simple change of dwelling. It was a deepening of commitment, a quiet step further into the mystery that had been drawing him from childhood. The journey itself was long and rugged, winding through valleys and forests, past terraced fields and clusters of stone homes perched along cliff edges. As he walked, the world around him seemed to shift from the familiarity of his early monastic life into something broader, more demanding, and yet strangely tender, as though God were guiding him gently toward a future he could not yet imagine. The monastery of Saint Maron stood upon a high hill, its ancient stones weathered by time, its courtyards open to the sky. When Youssef first glimpsed it, he felt a quiet stirring within him, a sense of arrival that was not born of comfort but of purpose. The monastery seemed to blend seamlessly into the mountain, its walls holding the memory of generations of monks who had prayed, labored, suffered, and offered their lives within its embrace. Here, he sensed, his vocation would be shaped more deeply, tested, refined, and strengthened by the rhythm of monastic life that flowed like a living stream through its halls. He entered with the humility expected of a novice, bowing his head as he stepped across the threshold. The monks welcomed him with solemn kindness, their eyes reflecting both the weight of their calling and the quiet joy that accompanies a life given wholly to God. There was no dramatic ceremony, no grand proclamation. His arrival passed with the same gentle invisibility that marked his earlier steps toward monastic life. Yet within him, something shifted. A sense of readiness, an inner assent to whatever lay ahead. The air at Anaya was thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and the distant echo of chanting. It felt as though the mountain itself were inviting him to surrender more fully. Life at Anaya was structured with careful discipline, but it possessed a certain quiet beauty. The hours of prayer framed each day like steady anchor points. Dawn prayers rising with the morning light, midday psalms echoing across the stone courtyards, evening chants descending like a soft veil over the mountain. In between these sacred hours, labor filled his time, labor that shaped not only the body but the heart. He worked in the fields, hoeing the earth with deliberate patience, planting seeds that would nourish the community. He tended the olive groves, learning the slow, careful art of pruning branches so that new life could emerge. He drew water from the well, chopped firewood, cleaned the monastery floors, and assisted in the kitchen with the quiet diligence that had already become his way of serving. The monks quickly recognized in him the same steady flame they had seen at Moifuk. His obedience was unwavering, his silence profound but not cold, his presence steady as the mountains that surrounded them. Though he was young, there was a maturity in him that did not come from knowledge or experience, but from a heart that had long been inclined toward God. He sought neither praise nor comfort, only the freedom to give himself fully to the life he had chosen. And in this desire, he found a deep peace. Anaya, however, brought new challenges. The work was heavier, the expectations higher, the rhythm more demanding. The longer prayers of the night office often left his eyes burning with fatigue. Yet he never faltered. The fields were expansive and difficult to work, especially during the heat of summer or the biting cold of winter. The silence, too, deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of noise, but a discipline that required the shaping of one's thoughts, desires, and impulses. In such silence, the soul is confronted with itself. For some, this confrontation becomes a source of struggle or confusion. For him, it became an invitation to surrender. It was during his formation at Anaya that he received the monastic habit, a moment of profound significance. The coarse wool robe, simple and unadorned, was not merely a garment, it was a declaration, a visible sign of the life he had chosen. As he donned it, he felt a quiet weight settle over him, the weight of a promise made before God and witnessed by his brothers. The robe marked the beginning of a deeper apprenticeship in the ways of humility, obedience, and hidden service. From that day forward, his identity was no longer rooted in the boy he had been in Beka Kafra, nor even in the novice who had labored at Meifuk, but in the monk who sought to disappear into the heart of God. His devotion to prayer grew stronger during this time. He spent hours in the chapel, his knees pressed into the stone floor, his gaze fixed on the crucifix. In the stillness of those long moments, he felt the gentle shaping of grace upon his soul. Sometimes he prayed for strength, sometimes for understanding, but most often he prayed simply to love God more fully, to surrender completely, to be emptied of self so that only the divine will might remain. Slowly, prayer became not an activity but the very breath of his days, a constant undercurrent beneath every task, every thought, every movement. The elders began to notice his growing interior depth. They saw in him a steadfastness rare among young monks, a steadiness that did not waver, even when faced with the harshness of a monastic discipline. They recognized his capacity for silence, not as withdrawal, but as a form of communion. His humility revealed itself not in words but in deeds, the way he yielded to correction without defensiveness, the way he worked without seeking acknowledgement, the way he listened with an attentiveness that made others feel at ease. He seemed to carry within him an invisible light, a quiet radiance that did not draw attention but could be felt in his presence. Yet for all his growth, he remained aware of his smallness. He saw himself not as gifted or exceptional, but simply as one called to serve. And in this self-understanding, he found both freedom and joy. The monastery was not a place of personal achievement, but a place of surrender. The brothers were not competitors, but companions on a shared pilgrimage toward the heart of God. In this environment, his soul flourished like a seed planted in fertile soil. As the seasons passed, through winters that cloaked the mountain in deep stillness and summers that filled the air with the scent of pine, he grew into his vocation with a quiet firmness. Anaya was shaping him, preparing him for a calling he could not yet foresee, a life that would one day transform countless lives through its hidden depth. There, under the watchful sky, his inner life grew roots that would one day astonish the world. Years of silence brought him to a moment of quiet fulfillment, a moment that seemed less like an arrival and more like the natural flowering of a seed planted long ago in the snow-covered mountains of Beka Kafra. After years of formation, discipline, and hidden transformation at the monastery of Saint Maron in Anaya, Youssef, now brother Charbel, was preparing for his ordination to the priesthood. It was a path that had unfolded slowly, one patient step at a time, shaped not by ambition or desire for honor, but by an unspoken longing that had been growing within him since childhood. For him, the priesthood was not an elevation, but a deepening, not a recognition, but a surrender. Each day, as he prayed in the dim chapel, tending the flame of devotion within him, he felt himself drawn more tenderly into the mystery of God's presence, as though his life were gradually being woven into something larger, more luminous, and infinitely more demanding. The final months before his ordination were marked by intensified prayer and study, though study came to him not as an intellectual pursuit, but as a way of learning how to love more fully. He immersed himself in Scripture, letting the words shape his heart rather than simply fill his mind. He pondered the lives of the saints, the writings of early desert fathers, and the teachings of the Church with the same quiet attentiveness that had carried him through childhood. Prayer had become the breath of his life, and through it he discovered deeper layers of humility, an awareness that the priesthood was a sacred trust he could receive only with trembling reverence. He knew that the hands which would soon hold the Eucharist must first be emptied of all that was not God. And so he emptied himself day after day, letting silence carve humility where subtle pride might hide. His spiritual director observed in him a sincerity so deep that it left little room for hesitation. When the time came for the final discernment, the elders spoke of him with confidence. He had proven himself obedient, faithful, humble, and steady, but beyond these visible virtues, they sensed in him something quieter still, a hidden strength, a luminous spirit shaped not by fervor, but by endurance. His calling was not loud or dramatic. It was like water cutting quietly through rock, shaping everything in its wake. They knew that ordaining him would not only serve the monastery, but would honor the quiet work God had already done in his soul. The day of his ordination dawned with a gentle clarity, the morning air sharp with the scent of resin rising from the pines. As he dressed in his simple garment, his hands trembled slightly. Not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. He walked to the chapel in the early light, each step echoing the countless unspoken prayers he had carried within him for years. The chapel was modest, but filled with a sacred stillness that seemed to deepen as he entered. Candles flickered like small constellations in the dim interior. The monks, his brothers, stood in silence, their faces softened by reverence, sensing that this was not merely a ceremony, but a moment of profound spiritual birth. As he knelt on the cold stone floor and the bishop placed his hands upon his head, Charbel felt a warmth rise through him, a quiet, steady presence that seemed to fill every corner of his being. It was not a sensation of triumph or elevation. Instead, it felt like being gathered into the heart of God, invited into a lifelong service where every joy and sacrifice would become an offering. Tears welled in his eyes, not from emotion alone, but from the awareness that his life was no longer his own. From that moment forward, he would belong entirely to God, his hands consecrated to bless, his voice consecrated to speak the words of the liturgy, his heart consecrated to bear the weight of humanity's suffering in silence. When he celebrated his first Mass, the chapel seemed to glow with a quiet radiance. His movements were unhurried, reverent, and deeply interior. Those who watched him sensed that something mysterious was unfolding, not in grandeur, but in stillness. As he held the Eucharist for the first time, his hands steadied with a grace that surpassed human certainty. His eyes lowered, his breath deepened, and for a moment he seemed almost lost in the mystery he was holding. It was as though time paused, as though heaven bent low to touch earth. In that moment, something within him sealed itself forever, an unbreakable bond between the priest and the God he served. From that day on, Charbel lived his priesthood with the same hidden devotion that had marked his monastic formation. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, and sought nothing beyond the grace to serve faithfully. The priesthood did not make him more visible. It made him more hidden. He did not preach long sermons or seek influence within the monastery. His gifts were quiet ones: the capacity to remain in prayer for long hours, the ability to work tirelessly without complaint, the willingness to take on tasks others found tedious or difficult, and the silent, unwavering love for the Eucharist that radiated through every aspect of his life. It was in the celebration of the Mass that he felt most fully alive. He approached the altar each day with the same trembling reverence he had known on the day of his ordination. The Eucharist was for him the center of everything, the anchor that held his soul in place. Often, after the other monks had departed, he lingered before the tabernacle, kneeling in stillness as though suspended in prayer. His devotion was not marked by emotional intensity, but by a deep familiarity, a gentle constancy, like the quiet companionship between old friends who no longer need words. His priesthood also deepened his compassion. Although he spoke little, those who approached him sensed a profound gentleness, a listening heart that absorbed their sorrows without judgment. He carried their burdens silently, lifting them in prayer during the long hours he spent alone in the chapel. He never sought to be known as a confessor or counselor, yet people felt drawn to him in moments of need. Something in him reflected the tenderness of God, not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet way he offered presence, humility, and prayer. Yet even as his spiritual depth grew, he remained deeply hidden. He resisted any form of recognition or praise, preferring the smallest tasks and refusing any role that brought attention. When asked to lead or teach, he obeyed, but he did so with reluctance, always returning to silence as soon as duty allowed. The priesthood, for him, was not a platform, but a place of continual self-emptying. And in this emptiness, he discovered the quiet joy that comes only from surrender. As the years passed, the monks around him noted something subtle but unmistakable. His presence seemed to draw the community into deeper prayer. His silence softened the hearts of those nearby. His devotion to the Eucharist infused the monastery with renewed fervor. He became a hidden pillar of strength, one whose holiness was felt rather than seen. But holiness doesn't stop at ordination. It slowly shapes itself through daily surrender. As priesthood began, Charbel lived as though nothing in him sought notice, slipping deeper into the quiet rhythm of monastic life with the same gentleness that had marked his earliest days in the mountains. If anything, the grace of ordination made him even more hidden. He did not consider himself elevated or transformed in the eyes of men. He saw only that God had entrusted him with a greater responsibility, one that required even greater silence, humility, and vigilance of heart. His fellow monks observed this shift with quiet admiration, though Charbel himself seemed unaware of any change. He continued to move through the monastery like a soft wind, felt more than heard, leaving behind a trail of stillness that others found strangely consoling. His life became a seamless blend of labor and prayer. He rose before dawn to prepare for the divine office, his footsteps gentle on the stone floors as he made his way to the chapel. There, in the dim light, he knelt with a stillness that resembled a rooted tree, unmovable and focused. His voice, when raised in chant, was low and steady, merging with the voices of the other monks in a harmony that washed through the chapel like a river of prayer. After the liturgy, he devoted himself to simple tasks, tending fields, repairing tools, assisting in the kitchen, or sweeping the courtyards. He performed each task without rush or complaint, giving it the same attention he gave to the Eucharist, as though everything in his life, no matter how ordinary, were an offering. His silence became one of his most defining traits. He was not mute, nor did he avoid others, but he spoke only when necessary, choosing words that were simple, measured, and free of self. When he listened, he did so with a kind of attentive gentleness that made others feel their thoughts had weight. He never interrupted, never hurried anyone's story, never dismissed another's concern. His silence was not emptiness, it was presence. It was a listening that drew from a deep well within him, a well formed through years of prayer and surrender. The monks began to say, quietly among themselves, that he possessed a soul made of obedience. Not the rigid obedience born of fear, but the supple obedience born of love. The desire to do only what God willed, even in the smallest things. If asked to do a task he had just completed, he did it again without question. If corrected for something he had not done, he bowed his head without defense. If assigned to work others avoided, he accepted it with gratitude, as though each task carried within it a hidden opportunity for grace. This obedience was not a performance, but the natural movement of a heart deeply aligned with God. His humility was equally profound. When praised for his dedication, he gently redirected the attention away from himself, often with a simple smile or a bowed head. He never sought to appear holier than others. In fact, he believed himself deeply unworthy of the priesthood. This sense of smallness gave him a freedom others envied. He did not cling to possessions, roles, or reputation, for he did not consider anything truly his. Everything, even his priesthood, was received as a gift to be held lightly and offered back to God. One of the monks later recalled that when walking through the fields with Charbel, it felt as though nature itself softened around him. Birds settled more calmly, winds quieted, even the sunlight seemed gentler in his presence. No one could explain this, yet all sensed it. Perhaps it was the transparency of his heart, the purity of intention that flowed from him like a quiet light. There are souls, rare in any age, whose holiness cannot be measured by deeds alone, but is felt like warmth in winter, a subtle radiance that touches those who draw near. Charbel was such a soul, though he himself never suspected it. His devotion to the Eucharist remained the center of his life, but now it deepened into something even more profound. He prepared for Mass with long periods of silent prayer, his face softened by an expression of longing that words could never convey. When he celebrated the liturgy, his movements were slow, reverent, almost tender. It was as though the veil between heaven and earth thinned around him. His brothers sometimes felt that during the consecration, he became aware of a world beyond their own, a world he glimpsed not through visions, but through the quiet burning of faith. After Mass, he lingered in the chapel, often remaining long after the candles sputtered low, seated before the tabernacle, in a stillness so complete that some wondered whether he had slipped into a kind of holy trance. Yet, it wasn't only in prayer that his sanctity revealed itself. It appeared in his willingness to help others before being asked, how he anticipated the needs of elderly monks, how he shouldered extra work during the harvest, how he quietly slipped food or water into the hands of weary travelers who knocked on the monastery door. He did not speak of charity, he simply lived it, letting kindness ripple outward in small, unnoticed gestures. To him, compassion was not an emotion, but an extension of prayer. Though he lived this silent sanctity with ease, it was not without trials. The enemy of souls does not leave such purity undisturbed. Charbel faced periods of interior darkness, moments when prayer seemed dry and the presence of God felt distant. But he bore these trials with the same patience he showed in everything. He did not complain or seek advice unless pressed. He simply continued to pray, trusting that God would restore what had been taken. And in time, light always returned, quietly, gently, leaving him stronger and more surrendered than before. His brothers observed how he never changed in temperament, even when fatigued or ill. His face retained its calm, his voice stayed soft, his hands moved with the same steady care. It was as though his sanctity had already begun to settle into his bones, shaping him quietly from within. The monks who lived alongside him during these years would later say that Charbel seemed to vanish even as he walked among them, not disappearing physically, but disappearing in the way a humble soul disappears into God. He sought no place of honor, no influence, no recognition. It was enough for him to serve, to pray, to surrender in silence. In this hiddenness, God was preparing him for something far greater, though no one, not even Charbel himself, could foresee what awaited him. And yet, unnoticed sanctity often prepares the deepest mysteries. With time, the mountains whispered to him in ways no human voice could, their quiet slopes drawing him toward a deeper solitude that had lived within him since childhood. Though he moved through the monastery with the same humility and devotion as always, something in him began to lean inward, gently, steadily, like a tree bending toward a hidden source of light. His brothers noticed the change long before he spoke of it. They saw how he lingered longer after prayers, how he sought the chapel in hours when others were resting, how silence seemed to cling to him with new intimacy. He worked as faithfully as ever, yet even in labor, an inner stillness followed him, a stillness that suggested he was listening to a call none of them could hear. The call to the hermitage was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, like the soft turning of a page, each moment revealing just a little more of what God desired of him. For years he had lived the monastic life with unwavering obedience, content within the rhythm of prayer, labor, and silent service. Yet beneath that contentment, a longing had been taking shape, an ache for deeper union, for a life stripped of every distraction, even the gentle distractions of community. He loved his brothers, cherished their companionship, and honored the structure of shared life. But his heart felt drawn to the wilderness where God speaks in ways too delicate for the world to notice. It was as though the solitude of his childhood cave had returned to him, urging him toward a new and more demanding solitude. But in a monastery, nothing of this nature was decided quickly or easily. The hermitage was not a place for those seeking quiet, simply because they preferred silence. It was a place of fierce discipline, of grueling austerity, of profound spiritual nakedness. Only a few were ever permitted to live there, and only after years of testing. The request itself had to be made with humility, never with confidence. And so Charbel waited. He continued to serve, to pray, to disappear into hiddenness. He carried the longing without clinging to it, offering it to God day after day, trusting that if the desire came from heaven, heaven would open the path. It was during this time of interior waiting that his brothers sensed more clearly than ever the depth of his sanctity. His silence grew more gentle, more expansive. His obedience, already remarkable, became almost luminous. He anticipated needs before they were spoken, volunteered for the hardest tasks, and embraced correction with a humility that softened even the strictest elders. When misunderstandings arose, he offered no defense. When sickness weighed on him, he bore it quietly. When joy touched him, it appeared as a soft glow in his eyes rather than any spoken expression. It was as though the very structure of his life, prayer, work, silence, had become one unbroken act of offering. Eventually, the longing within him grew too deep to hold in silence. He spoke to his superior with the same calm sincerity that had marked every major decision of his life. He did not speak dramatically or with persuasion. He simply expressed what he believed God was asking of him: the opportunity to live at the hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul, a small dwelling perched high in the mountains above Anaya. His superior listened with care. He knew Charbel's faithfulness, his humility, and his unwavering devotion. But he also knew the severity of hermit life. The hermitage was not meant to be a retreat. It was a furnace of purification, where the soul was laid bare before God, and where every comfort, emotional, physical, and spiritual, was stripped away. And so the superior did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Charbel closely for many months, testing his resolve, observing his strength, discerning the authenticity of his call. He assigned him new tasks, more exhausting chores, and unusual responsibilities, looking not for excellence but for the deep inner steadiness that hermits must possess. Charbel accepted everything without hesitation. He asked for nothing, resisted nothing, and remained unchanged in humility, whether given harsh tasks or gentle ones. His heart did not falter. His longing did not fade. And so, slowly, The superior's hesitation softened into recognition. He realized that Charbel was not seeking solitude for his own sake, but for God's. The call, he understood, was real. But one final test remained, an unspoken one. The monks began to ask Charbel to participate more deeply in communal life, inviting him into conversations, offering him roles that required interaction, placing him in situations that challenged his interior solitude. They watched to see whether his longing would shift into frustration or impatience. But Charbel remained as serene as ever. His heart did not push against community, nor did it withdraw. Instead, it rested gently within the life shared with his brothers, even as a different call pulsed quietly beneath the surface. At last the day arrived when his superior spoke the words he had longed for: permission to move to the hermitage. The announcement was made without ceremony, in the simplicity that defined monastic life. There were no celebrations, no farewells beyond what custom allowed. Yet in the hearts of those who knew him, there was a mixture of awe and sorrow. Awe, because they sensed that his life would deepen into a mystery few could comprehend. Sorrow, because they knew that once he crossed into the hermitage, he would become even more hidden than before. His presence felt only in the echo of prayers rising from the mountain. The journey from the monastery to the hermitage was short in distance, but vast in meaning. Charbel walked with steady steps, carrying only the necessities. The path wound upward through cedar groves and rocky terrain, the air growing thinner and more purified with each ascent. When he reached the small stone hermitage perched on the mountain's edge, he paused. It was a humble dwelling, 2 small rooms, a modest chapel, and little else. But for him, it felt like entering the innermost chamber of God's heart. He crossed the threshold with the same serenity he had shown when entering the monastery as a young novice. Nothing in his posture revealed excitement or fear. Instead, there was the quiet acceptance of a man who had finally arrived where grace had been leading him all along. The hermitage awaited him, both shelter and crucible. High above the valleys, Charbel entered a world made only of stone, wind, and prayer. A world stripped of all distraction, where the silence was so complete that even his own heartbeat seemed a foreign sound. The hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul was perched on a rugged slope, exposed to the elements, isolated from the rhythms of the monastery below. It was a place where life narrowed into its simplest form. 2 small rooms, a tiny chapel, a hard wooden bed, and the unbroken company of God. For most, such a place might have felt severe, even frightening. But for Charbel, it felt like the fulfillment of a longing that had been whispering to him since childhood. The moment he stepped across its threshold, he felt the mountains settle around him like ancient guardians, as if they had been waiting for him to finally disappear into their quiet depths. The hermit's life demanded a discipline far more intense than that of the monastery. The hours of prayer lengthened, the fasts deepened, and the solitude grew sharper. No longer surrounded by the gentle presence of fellow monks, he now faced a silence that pressed in on him from every side. There was no conversation to soften the loneliness, no communal work to lighten the load, no shared meals to anchor the day. Everything was pared down to the essentials: prayer, labor, sacrifice, and a ceaseless surrender of self. Life here was not simply a choice. It was a continual dying to everything except God. And Charbel embraced it fully, with the quiet, steady resolve of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this very moment. Each morning he rose long before dawn, lighting a small oil lamp whose flickering glow barely softened the darkness of the tiny chapel. The stone walls held the chill of the night, and the winter air often froze his breath as he prayed. Yet he knelt without wavering, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the crucifix that hung above the altar. The divine office filled the narrow space with whispered chant, the words rising like incense into the stillness. He prayed not for himself, but for the world. Farmers struggling in the fields, widows mourning their dead, children growing up in hardship, travelers lost in storms, souls wrestling with sorrow. Every pain he had ever witnessed, every story he had ever heard, lived in his prayer. And as the sun slowly rose over the distant horizon, its first light spilling across the mountains, he felt himself disappear more deeply into the mystery of God's mercy. After prayer came labor, hard physical labor that bound his body to the land as firmly as his soul was bound to God. He tended the small garden that clung stubbornly to the rocky soil, pruned the olive trees, hauled water from the cistern, chopped firewood, and maintained the simple structure of the hermitage with tools worn by generations before him. His hands grew calloused, his back bent with long hours of toil. Food was sparse, a few olives, some bread, a little water. The fasts were rigorous, especially during Lent, when he sometimes consumed only a few morsels each day. But he never faltered, never softened the discipline, for he believed that the body must be humbled so the soul could rise freely toward God. As the seasons changed, the hermitage changed with them. In winter, snow piled against the stone walls, cutting him off from the world below. The cold seeped into his bones, testing his endurance. He slept wrapped in thin blankets, shivering through nights so harsh that even the oil in his lamp grew thick and sluggish. Yet he did not complain. He offered the cold as a form of prayer, a quiet sacrifice known only to God. In spring, the mountains burst into life, wildflowers blooming between rocks, streams rushing with melted snow, birds filling the air with song. Charbel saw in nature a reflection of resurrection, the eternal rhythm of death and renewal. In summer, the heat pressed down upon the hermitage like a consuming fire, drying the earth and leaving little water. He bore this too with patience, drinking only what he needed to survive. In autumn, he harvested olives, gathered herbs for the monastery, and prepared the hermitage for the coming cold, moving with the steady rhythm of a man whose life had become one continuous prayer. But it was not only physical hardship that marked his life. The solitude itself became a crucible, revealing the deepest corners of the soul. The silence, so complete and unbroken, sometimes swelled into a weight that pressed directly upon his heart. Memories from childhood floated back, his mother's voice, the laughter of villagers, the warmth of the family home. At times, loneliness touched him with a cold hand, but instead of shrinking from it, he embraced it, offering even loneliness to God, trusting that in the emptiness, divine love would fill what human love could not reach. There were nights when the wind howled against the hermitage walls like a living creature, rattling shutters and shaking the very stones. On such nights he knelt longer in prayer, listening not to the storm but to the quiet that waited beneath it. There were days when spiritual dryness set in, when prayer felt heavy and God seemed distant. Yet he continued, hour after hour, holding the silence as one holds a fragile candle against the wind. For Charbel, faith was not a feeling. It was fidelity, steady, unwavering, born from the certainty that God remains even when the heart grows cold. Those who visited the hermitage, rare individuals sent by the monastery, often left with a sense that they had stepped into a different world. They found Charbel radiant in his poverty, serene in his solitude, his eyes softened by a peace that did not come from comfort, but from surrender. He spoke little, but when he did, His words carried a gentleness that seemed to emerge from a depth far greater than the human heart alone. Visitors returned with stories they could hardly explain, of a presence in the hermitage that felt both humble and immense, of a silence so profound it seemed to cradle their souls, of a holiness that did not shine like the sun, but glowed like embers in the dark. Years passed in this hidden rhythm, each day folding quietly into the next like soft waves on the shore. Nothing changed outwardly. He lived, prayed, and worked in obscurity. But inwardly, the mystery of God continued its tender work, shaping him into a vessel of grace through the slow, steady chiseling of sacrifice. Yet even here, suffering carved its own secret path within his body. And then, one winter night, the body that had carried so much hidden sacrifice finally faltered, collapsing under the weight of years spent in silence, fasting, and unrelenting devotion. The hermitage, which had long been his sanctuary, now became the place of his deepest physical suffering. Outside, the mountains lay wrapped in a heavy stillness, their peaks coated in frost, their slopes dark beneath the pale glow of a cold moon. Inside, the narrow stone walls held a deeper quiet, one that seemed to tremble with the mystery of what was taking place. Charbel, now an older monk whose worn hands bore the marks of decades of labor, knelt before the altar to celebrate the Christmas Vigil Mass, unaware that these sacred moments would be the last liturgy he would ever complete on earth. He had risen that morning as he always did, long before dawn, lighting the oil lamp in the chapel, preparing himself through prayer for the long day ahead. The air was icy, the stones beneath his feet colder still, but he felt no discomfort. His heart, steadied by years of surrender, was at peace. Christmas, for him, was not a day of festivity, but of profound contemplation, an invitation to kneel once more before the mystery of the Incarnation. As he vested for the liturgy, his hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from reverence. Each movement was slow, deliberate, tender, as though he were preparing to meet Christ in a wholly new way. During the Mass, the Hermitage chapel glowed softly in the candlelight. The walls seemed to close gently around him, holding him in a quiet embrace as he spoke the familiar prayers. His voice, aged but steady, rose and fell with the rhythm of the liturgy. The cold air swirled faintly with incense. Outside, snow began to drift silently across the mountains, blanketing the earth in white. This small, hidden celebration, witnessed by only one other monk, carried a weight that neither of them understood in that moment, a sense that heaven was drawing unusually near. It happened at the consecration. As he lifted the host, his face softened into an expression of deep yearning, the kind of yearning that had shaped his life since childhood. Then suddenly, gently, as though his strength were quietly dissolving, his body began to sway. The host remained raised for a moment longer, held in hands that had spent years trembling with devotion. Then, with a breath that escaped like a final offering, he collapsed. The other monk rushed forward, catching him just before he struck the stone floor. Charbel's eyes were open but distant, as though gazing at something no earthly sight could match. His lips moved in a whisper, too soft to be heard, but his companion knew he was praying. They carried him to his small wooden bed, the same narrow frame on which he had slept through years of cold winters and long nights of prayer. Now it held him gently, like a final resting place for a body worn thin by sacrifice. His breathing was labored, shallow, uneven. Pain coursed through him, twisting his features, yet he uttered no word of complaint. The suffering that had lived quietly within him for so long now revealed itself plainly, but he accepted it with the same serenity that marked every moment of his life. Even in agony, his face bore a hint of peace, a soft glow, a quiet surrender, as though his soul were being lifted into the hands of God even before death arrived. News of his collapse reached the monastery, and the monks made the steep ascent to the hermitage despite the bitter cold. They found him pale and still, his body trembling with fever, his clothing soaked with sweat, yet his eyes fluttered open when they touched his forehead, and he offered them a faint smile, one of gratitude, of recognition, of love. They wrapped him in blankets, tended to him with gentle hands, and prayed around him. But he had already begun to slip away from the world, drifting toward the quiet threshold he had spent his entire life preparing to cross. For 2 days, he lay in his small room, surrounded by the brothers who had long admired his hidden holiness. His breathing slowed little by little, each breath a labor, each moment a surrender. His lips formed silent prayers. Sometimes his fingers moved as though tracing the sign of the cross upon the air. Once, in a whisper that trembled like a fading flame, he uttered the name of Jesus. At other times, he seemed unaware of his surroundings, lost in a realm beyond reach. The monks who kept vigil noticed something remarkable. His suffering did not diminish his peace, though fever raged through him. Though his body shook with pain, his expression remained calm, softened by a serenity that could not have come from earthly comfort. It was as though he had stepped into a hidden chamber of grace, where suffering did not crush the soul, but refined it, purified it, lifted it. His entire life, a life of prayer, silence, sacrifice, and total surrender, now reached its final offering. His pain was not a punishment, it was a completion. On the evening of December 24th, as the bells of the monastery rang softly in the cold air, signaling the vigil of Christmas, Charbel's breathing slowed to a whisper. A profound stillness settled over the room. The brothers gathered around him sensed that the moment had come. His eyes opened one final time, gazing upward, not at the ceiling, but at something invisible to all but him. His lips moved once more, forming a final prayer that seemed to rise straight into the heart of God. Then, with a calm exhale, his earthly journey ended. His face, which had been contorted with pain only moments before, relaxed into a profound, almost luminous peace. It was as though suffering had been wiped away by an unseen hand, leaving behind a quiet radiance that filled the room with awe. The monks, moved beyond words, knelt beside his bed, praying in hushed voices. The hermitage, for years filled with hidden sacrifice, now held the stillness of a soul returning to its Creator. Word spread quietly among the brothers as they prepared his body for burial. They washed him, clothed him with reverence, and carried him down the mountain through falling snow. Their steps were heavy, not only from the terrain, but from the weight of grief mingled with wonder. They had known him as a humble monk, a silent servant of God. They did not yet know they were walking with a saint. What happens to a soul that has given everything? When Charbel left this world, the mountains did not grow darker. If anything, the stillness that followed seemed to hold a gentle shimmer, as though creation itself understood that an extraordinary soul had slipped quietly into eternity. His brothers, weary from the long night of vigil and the descent from the hermitage, carried his body to the monastery with tender reverence. Snow fell in slow, solemn flakes, gathering on their robes and softening their footsteps as they moved along the rugged path. The cold bit at their hands and faces, but they pressed on, guided by the faint glow of lanterns, and the deep conviction that they were accompanying a man whose hidden holiness had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. They reached the monastery shortly before dawn. The courtyard was silent, the small stone church dimly lit by a few flickering candles. The monks laid Charbel's body near the altar, where he had prayed countless times, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the sanctuary lamp. Those who looked upon him were struck by the peace that radiated from his still features. Death had not dimmed him. It had unveiled him. His face, once lined by years of suffering and labor, now appeared smooth, serene, almost luminous. It was as though he was resting in a joy deeper than anything the world could offer. His funeral was simple, as monastic funerals always were. There was no great crowd, no procession of dignitaries, just the brothers whose lives had intertwined with his, chanting the psalms with quiet reverence, lifting his name to God with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. They placed him in a wooden coffin and carried him to the cemetery, a small enclosure of stone walls and humble graves nestled into the mountainside. The earth was frozen, so they struggled as they dug, their breath forming pale clouds in the cold morning air. Yet, despite the difficulty, there was a sense of grace surrounding the moment, a sense that this burial was not the end but the beginning of something mysterious. The ground, once prepared, received his body with solemn dignity. The monks lowered the coffin, prayed over it, and covered it with earth. Snow began to fall again, dusting the fresh grave, settling over the cemetery like a blanket. The mountains, vast and indifferent to most human affairs, seemed to bow in silence. Charbel's life, marked by hidden sacrifice and profound humility, was now hidden once more, this time in the cold, quiet embrace of the earth. For a time, the world carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The monks returned to their daily routines. Visitors who had occasionally climbed to the hermitage no longer found him there, and the mountain paths slowly reclaimed their solitude. Yet within the monastery, a change had begun. Subtle at first, like the faint stirrings of wind before a storm. The monks sensed his absence deeply. Not because he had been central to their daily lives. Indeed, he had been intentionally hidden and rarely involved in communal matters, but because his silent presence had been a steady anchor. Without him, something felt different, as though a lamp had been extinguished, and the air grown strangely expectant. Then, several days after his burial, something inexplicable happened. A young monk, assigned to keep watch over the cemetery at night, noticed a faint glow rising above the graves. At first he thought it a trick of the moonlight, a reflection on the snow. But as he looked closer, he realized the light was not drifting or flickering like a candle, nor was it fading. It was steady, warm, almost golden, illuminating the entire cemetery with a soft radiance. He approached cautiously, heart pounding, unsure whether he was witnessing something heavenly or something he could not yet understand. To his astonishment, the light appeared to rise directly from Charbel's grave. Unable to believe his eyes, he ran to the monastery and woke the others. Within moments, several monks hurried to the cemetery, their lanterns swinging wildly as they moved through the snow. When they reached the gravesite, they stopped in their tracks. The young monk's report had not been exaggerated. A glow, gentle yet unmistakable, hovered above the earth where Charbel had been buried. It illuminated the snow, the stone wall, even the branches of the nearby trees. It was not harsh or frightening. It was beautiful, peaceful, unworldly. They stood in silence, awe gripping their hearts. No one spoke. No one dared move closer. It felt as though they were standing before a divine mystery, one that required reverence more than analysis. The light remained, unwavering, for hours, long into the night, long after the monastery's candles had burned low. Some monks prayed aloud, trembling. Others knelt in the snow. Some simply stood with tears streaming down their faces, unable to comprehend what their eyes beheld. By morning, the light had faded, but the memory of it remained so vivid that not one of them doubted what they had seen. Word spread quietly through the region, carried by shepherds, villagers, and travelers who passed near the monastery. Many were skeptical, but those who knew the monks understood they would not invent such a thing. And soon enough, others came to witness it for themselves. The light returned, again and again. Night after night, a glow rose above Charbel's grave, drawing people from nearby villages and distant towns. Some arrived doubtful, only to fall to their knees in tears. Others came burdened with illness or sorrow, seeking understanding or consolation. What they found was something far deeper than explanation. A presence, a peace, a quiet sense that heaven was stirring through the mountains of Anaya in ways the world could not ignore. The monks, overwhelmed by the number of visitors and the intensity of the phenomenon, were forced to exhume Charbel's body. They expected decay, the natural progression of death. What they found instead left them speechless. His body was intact, soft, flexible, whole, preserved in a way no earthly explanation could account for. His face appeared serene, untouched by time, bearing the same quiet radiance it had held at the moment of death. And the mystery had only begun. In the days that followed, a strange phenomenon drew the world to his silent tomb, for what began as a soft light shimmering above the cemetery soon revealed itself as something even more bewildering, something that left monks, villagers, physicians, and skeptics alike struggling to understand the mystery unfolding before their eyes. As the brothers at Anaya prepared to rebury Charbel's incorrupt body after its unexpected preservation, they noticed a dampness seeping through the cloth that wrapped him. At first they assumed it was water from the cold earth, or perhaps moisture from the stone walls of the crypt. But as they uncovered him more carefully, a fragrance rose into the air. Subtle, sweet, unlike anything naturally found in the mountain soil. The cloth was not simply damp, it was saturated. A thick, reddish fluid oozed from his pores, pooling beneath him, staining the cloth and the wooden planks upon which his body rested. The monks stepped back, startled. Corpses do not behave this way. Human bodies, especially those left in cold and damp earth, decompose in predictable ways. They do not perspire. They do not exude fluids that bear the scent of incense and fresh herbs. And yet this was happening before their eyes. A body buried weeks earlier was now releasing a mixture of oil, blood, and water, warm to the touch, fresh and abundant. News spread quickly. Soon villagers began climbing the mountain to see for themselves. Some came with fear, unsure whether such a thing was a sign of holiness or something they did not want to understand. Others came with curiosity, wondering whether the stories had grown exaggerated in the telling. But most came with hope, quiet, trembling hope. For the mountains of Lebanon had long held stories of saints whose lives bore the marks of grace, but none had witnessed such a sign in their own lifetime. The monks, overwhelmed by the constant flow of visitors, attempted to contain the situation. They cleaned the body, replaced the wrappings, and placed him in a new coffin. But before long, the fluid seeped through again. They changed the garments. The fluid continued. They sealed the coffin. It leaked. At one point, the liquid accumulated so heavily that it filled the bottom of the coffin, dripping out onto the stone floor. The scent of it filled the chapel. Doctors were called in, along with civil officials, priests from other monasteries, and local authorities. All were perplexed. Some whispered of deception, but the monks knew no trickery. They were simple men who had lived alongside Charbel in silence and simplicity. Their stunned expressions made clear that they understood the gravity of what was occurring. The physicians examined the body with the tools available at the time. They expected to find decay beneath the fluid, the normal collapse of organs and tissues. Instead, they discovered a body that still appeared strangely intact, pliable, flexible, unaffected by the natural processes of death. They drained the fluid, hoping that once the accumulation was removed, the phenomenon would cease. But within days, the liquid returned, seeping fresh and warm as though the body were alive. Doctors shook their heads. Civil authorities declared that the body be monitored. Journalists began to write of the strange occurrence in remote Lebanon. Pilgrims arrived in droves, climbing the mountain with lanterns, walking through the cold night just for a chance to kneel near his grave. Among the first pilgrims were those who carried heavy sorrows. Mothers brought their sick children wrapped in blankets, hoping for a blessing. Old men walked slowly with wounds that had troubled them for years. Women burdened by grief came seeking peace. Many who knelt beside his tomb later reported a deep calm washing over them, a lightness in their hearts, a sense that they were being held by something larger than their suffering. Some reported recoveries, unexpected, unexplainable, swift. Tales of healing began to spread far beyond the mountains of Anaya. Stories traveled to Beirut, to Damascus, to the villages of the Bekaa Valley, and eventually to faraway lands. The monks, both humbled and unnerved, continued to care for the body. They cleaned the fluids daily, sometimes twice a day. They observed how the cloths soaked through, how the oil seeped from his chest, arms, and legs, how the fluid seemed to carry warmth even in the coldest winter nights. One monk later wrote that touching the cloth felt like touching something alive, soft, warm, almost pulsing. Another recalled that when he wiped the fluid away, the skin beneath appeared fresh, as though the man had only just died moments earlier. The church, cautious and careful in evaluating miracles, began a formal investigation. Priests and bishops traveled to Anaya, examining the body, questioning the monks, observing the phenomenon firsthand. They kept records of healings attributed to his intercession, gathering testimonies from those who claimed to have experienced unexplainable cures after praying to him. Some were simple villagers with stories of relief from pain or recovery from fever. Others were individuals with serious conditions that doctors had deemed incurable. In each case, the common thread was the same. They had prayed before his tomb, touched the cloth stained with the mysterious fluid, or invoked his name with sincerity. But it was not merely the healings that moved people. It was the man himself. His life of silence, humility, obedience, and hidden holiness. Villagers who had once seen him pass quietly on the road now remembered his gentleness. Monks who had lived with him recalled his silence, his patience, his tireless labor. They spoke of his devotion to the Eucharist, his reverence during the Mass, his ability to disappear entirely into prayer. Every story, every testimony revealed a man whose sanctity had taken root long before any miracle began to unfold. In time, the phenomenon of the fluid became impossible to dismiss. It continued for years, around 25 in total. During that time, the body remained flexible, intact, seemingly untouched by decay. The monks changed the garments dozens of times, each set becoming soaked with the fragrant liquid. Some of the cloths were given to pilgrims, who kept them as relics. Many claimed to experience peace, healing, or spiritual consolation after touching them. The monks, deeply moved by the unfolding mystery, saw in it not a spectacle, but a continuation of Charbel's silent service, a kind of spiritual labor that began only after his earthly one had ended. It was said that the fluid resembled a mixture of sweat and blood, a symbol that echoed the agony of Gethsemane and the suffering of Christ. The Church, careful and deliberate, avoided hasty conclusions. Yet as time passed, and as the body continued to exude the mysterious substance without any natural explanation, the faithful came to see the phenomenon not as something strange, but as a sign of God's closeness, a sign that the hidden life of Charbel had not ended with his death, but was flowering into a new form of grace. And so the people came, by foot, by horse, by carriage, climbing the mountain to kneel before the tomb of a monk who had wanted nothing more than to live unnoticed. They came with burdens, with sorrows, with questions their hearts could no longer hold alone, and many left transformed. What unseen grace stirs within a life hidden so long? Word traveled far beyond Lebanon, like a quiet breeze carrying hope across continents, reaching ears that had never heard of the hermit who had lived and died in silence. At first, the accounts of miraculous healings associated with Charbel seemed like stories confined to the mountains of Anaya, tales shared between villagers, passed along by shepherds, carried by wandering peddlers who traveled from town to town. But as more and more people came seeking healing, and as more testimonies emerged from those whose lives had been touched in inexplicable ways, the news began to ripple outward, crossing borders with a strange and gentle insistence. It was as though the world, weary from its own suffering, had found in Charbel's story a thread of hope it did not want to lose. What astonished many was not simply the healings themselves, but their variety. Some were physical, tumors shrinking overnight, paralysis easing into movement, blindness giving way to sight. Others were spiritual, hearts reconciled after decades of bitterness, souls freed from anxieties that had choked them for years, individuals who had abandoned prayer suddenly rediscovering faith at his tomb. And many, perhaps most, were quiet restorations of peace. Burdens lifted, fears eased, sorrows softened. These were not dramatic miracles meant to draw attention, but gentle ones, reflecting the very character of the saint through whom they flowed. As the years passed, the monastery began documenting these occurrences with increasing care. Monks recorded the names of those who sought Charbel's intercession, took note of their conditions, and followed up on their stories when they returned with gratitude. Letters poured into the monastery from distant countries, France, Egypt, Syria, Italy, even South America, each bearing witness to healing received after praying to the silent hermit of Lebanon. Sometimes the letters contained medical reports, physicians confirming improvements they could not explain. Other times they contained simple testimonies written in shaky handwriting, telling of burdens lifted or fears eased. Each letter, no matter how modest, added another brushstroke to the growing portrait of Charbel's influence, an influence that continued to expand long after his death. What was most striking to the monks was how Charbel's intercession transcended religious, cultural, and linguistic boundaries. People who were not Maronite, not Catholic, not even Christian began to seek him. Muslim families, who held a deep respect for holy men regardless of creed, came to Anaya with the same sincerity as Christian pilgrims. Druze villagers, touched by the stories, came asking for blessings and healing. Travelers from Europe who had never set foot in Lebanon wrote to the monastery requesting prayers through his intercession. And years later, when Lebanese immigrants scattered across the globe, they carried with them not only memories of home, but stories of the hermit whose light had shone above the mountains after his death. In cities like São Paulo, Montreal, Sydney, Detroit, and Paris, they built shrines in his honor, shared testimonies of healing, and invoked his name during times of illness or trouble. Through them, the devotion to Charbel grew like a living vine, stretching across oceans. Yet even as his name spread, the heart of his mystery remained grounded in the simplicity of his life. People were drawn to him not because he had been a famous preacher or a great theologian, but because he had lived without seeking notice. His holiness was made of silence, of obedience, of hidden sacrifices offered in solitude. And it was precisely this hiddenness that seemed to resonate in a world increasingly hungry for authenticity. Charbel was not a saint who dazzled with grandeur. He was a saint who disappeared. And it was his disappearance that made space for God to shine. The healings associated with him were not isolated events, but gradually formed a pattern that the Church could not ignore. Physicians documented cases in which individuals recovered without any medical explanation, often after doctors had exhausted every treatment. One physician wrote that after examining a patient who had been cured of a severe illness following prayer to Charbel, he could find no scientific rationale, only the possibility of an intervention beyond the ordinary. Another reported that the speed of recovery in a particular case defied every known medical timeline. The monks kept these letters carefully, aware that while miracles are gifts, they also require discernment. Villagers told stories of waking in the night with a sudden sense of peace after praying for a loved one. Others claimed that they had seen Charbel in dreams, offering comfort or instruction. Some reported that they had felt a hand rest upon their shoulder during moments of despair, only to turn and find no one there. Such stories were difficult to verify, yet impossible to ignore. They carried the quiet conviction of those who had experienced something beyond their understanding. One of the earliest and most widely reported miracles involved a young woman who had been gravely ill. Her family, desperate for help, brought her to Anaya, where they placed her in the chapel near Charbel's tomb. As they prayed through the night, a warmth spread through her body, and by morning she had regained strength she had not felt in months. Her recovery was swift and complete. Physicians examined her and could find no trace of the illness that had once threatened her life. Word of this healing spread quickly, drawing more pilgrims to the mountain. Another involved a farmer from a nearby village who had been unable to walk for years. After praying at Charbel's grave and touching the cloth soaked in the mysterious fluid, he felt a tingling in his legs. Days later, he took his first steps. By the end of the month, he was working again in his fields. He credited his recovery not to any human intervention, but to the saint who had lived in silence only a few miles from his home. These stories became countless over time, forming a tapestry of grace that stretched across generations. The monastery, once a place of quiet solitude, became a center of pilgrimage. Yet even amidst the growing crowds, the monks ensured that Charbel's spirit remained preserved in the atmosphere of the place. Silence continued to permeate the chapel. The mountains remained guardians of stillness. Pilgrims who arrived in desperation often left with peace, not only because of healing, but because the very environment seemed to draw them into a deeper communion with God. Charbel's influence transcended physical healing. Some who prayed at his tomb found courage to forgive old wounds. Others discovered renewed strength to carry their daily burdens. Many spoke of feeling more grounded, more open to God's will, more capable of facing the uncertainties of life. In this sense, the miracles were not simply supernatural events. They were invitations. Invitations to surrender, to trust, to rediscover the presence of God in suffering. And through it all, Charbel remained the same silent, hidden figure he had been in life. He did not seek glory. He did not seek recognition. His holiness flowed not from his actions alone, but from the posture of his heart, a heart that had been emptied of self long before his death, so that grace could pass through him freely, like water through uncarved stone. Holiness, it seems, cannot be confined by stone, distance, or death. As decades passed, the Church listened carefully to the echo of his life, studying not only the miracles attributed to him, but the extraordinary simplicity that defined his earthly journey. While the world marveled at the supernatural signs, the incorrupt body, the mysterious fluid, the healings that crossed borders and generations, the monks who had known him remembered something more subtle, more essential. They remembered his silence, his humility, his unwavering devotion to prayer and the Eucharist. For the Church, it was this combination, the hidden life and the visible signs, that formed the foundation of their discernment. Holiness, they knew, is not measured by miracles alone. Miracles may draw attention, but it is the life of virtue, lived with constancy and love, that reveals the true presence of God in a soul. And Charbel's entire existence had been one long, quiet offering. By the mid-20th century, the devotion to Charbel had grown so widespread that the Holy See undertook a formal investigation into his life and the miracles attributed to him. Documents were gathered from the monasteries, testimonies collected from villagers and pilgrims, letters reviewed from around the world. Medical reports were scrutinized with rigorous care. Experts traveled to Anaya to examine the preserved body, noting how unusual, how inexplicable its condition remained, even decades after his death, and even after the mysterious fluid had finally ceased flowing. It was not merely the absence of decay that astonished them, but the serenity of his features, the gentle repose that seemed to radiate peace, even from within the confines of a coffin. The Church proceeded slowly, reverently, aware that declaring someone a saint is not a recognition given lightly. It requires proof, not only of miracles but of holiness woven into the fabric of an ordinary life. And so the Vatican reviewed the details of his early years in Beka Kafra, the quiet devotion of his childhood, the sacrifice of leaving home, the long formation at Maifuk and Anaya, his gentle obedience, his hidden humility, his tireless labor. They studied his life at the Hermitage, his austere practices, his deep love for the Eucharist, his final moments during the Christmas Mass. They listened to the monks who had walked beside him, men who spoke of him not with awe, but with tenderness, as one speaks of a brother whose presence had softened the world. In time, the first official miracle attributed to his intercession was recognized, the healing of Sister Mary Abel Kamari, a nun suffering from a debilitating illness that had resisted all medical treatment. After intense prayer at Charbel's tomb, her condition improved with startling speed, defying every expectation. Her healing was documented thoroughly, her physicians providing testimony that left no room for natural explanation. Not long after, a second miracle was confirmed, the healing of Iskandar Obeid, who had suffered from severe eye disease. Doctors had warned him that blindness was imminent. Yet after praying to Charbel and applying oil from the lamps burning near his tomb, his vision returned. Medical examination revealed no trace of the disease. With these miracles formally recognized, the Church moved forward. On December 5, 1965, near the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI beatified Charbel Makhlouf, presenting him to the world as a model of hidden sanctity. The Pope spoke with reverence of the monk who had lived unknown to most, yet who now inspired thousands across the globe. Beatification was a moment of profound joy, especially for the Lebanese faithful, who saw in Charbel a reflection of their own endurance, their own quiet strength during years of hardship. But the story did not end there. In the years following his beatification, more miracles were reported, healings that continued to draw attention from both the faithful and the skeptical. Among the most famous was the healing of Mrs. Mariam Awais, a woman suffering from cancer. Her recovery, instantaneous and complete, astonished her doctors and spread far beyond the borders of Lebanon. Another involved a man named Nohad el-Chami, who suffered from partial paralysis. After dreaming of Saint Charbel and waking to find two mysterious marks on her neck, as if hands had touched her, she discovered she could walk again. Doctors verified her condition and confirmed that her healing had no medical explanation. These miracles led the Church to consider the final step of canonization. Once again, a thorough review was undertaken. The miracles were investigated, documented, and tested according to the rigorous standards of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. The Church sought clarity, discernment, truth, not spectacle. Only when all evidence met the highest spiritual and scientific scrutiny did the Church declare what countless souls around the world already believed. On October 9, 1977, Pope Paul VI canonized Saint Charbel Makhlouf, proclaiming him a saint of the Universal Church. In St. Peter's Basilica that day, a radiant joy filled the air. Lebanese pilgrims wept openly, waving small flags and singing hymns. They had come from villages tucked into the mountains, from bustling cities, from distant corners of the diaspora, carrying with them not only devotion, but pride. For in Saint Charbel, they saw the holiness of their land, the rugged mountains, the ancient monasteries, the deep-rooted faith of their ancestors. The Pope spoke of Charbel as a universal model of Christian virtue, emphasizing that his solitude had not separated him from humanity, but had made him more deeply one with it. Canonization did not elevate Charbel in the hearts of the faithful. It simply confirmed what had been known for decades. His was a holiness born not of extraordinary deeds, but of ordinary fidelity, a holiness forged in silence, humility, and the hidden labors of daily life. A holiness that flowed like water from a well so deep that even death could not stop it from reaching the thirsty. After his canonization, devotion to Saint Charbel only continued to grow. Shrines dedicated to him appeared in countries far from Lebanon. Churches placed his image near their altars. Pilgrims journeyed to Anaya with renewed fervor, some walking barefoot up the mountain in acts of thanksgiving or penance. His icon, showing his gentle eyes, his long beard, his simple monastic hood, became one of the most beloved images in the Middle East. Countless homes placed his portrait beside their crucifixes, candles flickering beneath his gaze. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his legacy is the way it continues to touch souls across divisions of religion, culture, and geography. Muslims, Druze, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and even those with no religious affiliation continue to seek his intercession. Many claim to feel peace in his presence, whether at his shrine in Anaya or through prayer offered from distant lands. It is as though the silence that defined his life became a language the whole world could understand. In the quiet halls of the monastery, the monks who now guard his tomb speak often of the gift he left them. Not the miracles, those belong to God alone, but the example of a man who lived without seeking greatness, who embraced poverty and obscurity, and whose holiness was a whisper rather than a shout. They speak of how his life reminds them, and reminds all who come seeking him, that true sanctity often grows far from applause, far from recognition, far from noise. In his silence, a message waited for the world to hear. Now, looking back across the span of his earthly and heavenly journey, the legacy of Saint Charbel appears not as a story of dramatic triumphs or public accomplishments, but as a tapestry woven from silence, sacrifice, and a holiness so gentle that at first seemed invisible. And yet this invisible holiness has become a light for the world, a quiet radiance that continues to reach into the lives of those who suffer, those who pray, and those who search for meaning in the shadows of their own struggles. In the century and a half since his death, Charbel has remained one of the most beloved saints of the Middle East, a figure whose presence transcends borders, languages, and backgrounds. A man who, in life, wished to vanish in the mountain winds, and who in death became a source of healing and peace for countless souls across continents. When pilgrims arrive at Anaya today, they often describe a feeling that descends upon them long before they reach the monastery. As they approach the quiet village, surrounded by terraced fields and ancient cedars, a stillness settles in, the kind that invites the heart to slow its pace, the mind to loosen its burdens, and the soul to awaken to something delicate and sacred. The air grows lighter, the hills seem to draw nearer, and the path becomes a kind of pilgrimage trail leading not only to a shrine, but into the deeper chambers of one's own spirit. Many say they feel as though they are stepping into Charbel's silence, the same silence that shaped him through childhood, formation, priesthood, and hermitage, the silence through which God spoke to him so clearly. Inside the monastery chapel where his tomb rests, that silence becomes almost tangible. The stone walls, worn smooth by generations of pilgrims, hold an atmosphere of reverence that transcends words. Candles flicker near his relics. Icons of the saint, showing his solemn face beneath the monastic hood, stare gently into the soft light. Visitors kneel on the worn rugs, some praying aloud, some praying in tears, others simply sitting with their hands folded, absorbing the peace that seems to emanate from the stone floor itself. No matter how many people fill the chapel, the quiet remains. It is as though Charbel's spirit still guards the space, inviting each soul who enters to breathe more deeply, to lay down sorrow, to listen for the whisper of God beneath the noise of life. What moves people most is not simply the miracles associated with him, though they are numerous and astounding. What moves them is the way his story reveals the hidden grandeur of a life lived entirely for God. In a world that often celebrates visibility, success, productivity, and noise, Charbel stands as a gentle counterpoint, an invitation to return to the simplicity of prayer, the humility of surrender, the beauty of quiet faithfulness. His life tells us that sanctity does not require brilliance or charisma or public acclaim. It requires listening. It requires trust. It requires a willingness to offer the whole self, day after day, even when no one is watching, even when no visible fruit seems to appear. Many who come to Anaya do not ask for a miracle. They ask for courage, for peace, for clarity. They ask for healing in relationships, for patience in suffering, for strength in grief. They come with burdens they can no longer carry alone: illness, heartbreak, fear, despair, and they kneel beside Charbel's tomb, hoping for the grace to continue. And again, they leave with something they did not expect. Some leave with extraordinary healings. Others leave with a renewed heart. Some depart with the ability to forgive. others with a softened sorrow that no longer crushes them. Many leave whispering that they felt seen, even though the saint they came to visit had once sought to be forgotten. One of the remarkable aspects of Charbel's legacy is how deeply it resonates across different cultures and religions. In Lebanon, his shrine is visited by Christians, Muslims, Druze, and people with no religious affiliation at all. Many Muslim families speak of him with affection and reverence, referring to him as a holy man of God. They come to his tomb with the same hope as Christian pilgrims, lighting candles and praying silently. They do not ask whether he belonged to their faith tradition. They simply recognize holiness when they encounter it. The humility and purity of his life form a bridge that transcends centuries of division, inviting all who come near him to remember that God's light is not confined by human borders. Diaspora communities have woven him into their lives as well. Lebanese families living in faraway cities have built chapels and shrines dedicated to him, bringing his quiet presence into neighborhoods thousands of miles from Anaya. His icon hangs in living rooms, hospitals, shops, and workplaces around the world. Stories of his intercession circulate widely. Stories of cancer patients whose scans suddenly cleared, of parents whose grief eased after years of mourning, of individuals who returned to faith after decades of distance. These testimonies, though deeply personal, share a common thread: an encounter with a saint who lived in silence and continues to work in silence, touching hearts not with thunder, but with a whisper. Yet perhaps the most powerful legacy Charbel leaves is not the miracles themselves, but the lesson his life teaches: that holiness is possible for anyone willing to surrender. His story shows us that suffering can become a doorway to grace, that solitude can become a place of encounter, that humility can become a form of strength, and that a life lived entirely for God can bear fruit far beyond anything we can imagine. Charbel's journey, from a small mountain village to a hermitage, and from a hidden death to worldwide veneration, reveals that God delights in raising up the lowly, in using the forgotten to heal the broken, in turning silence into a song that spans generations. For those who walk away from his shrine with tears on their cheeks, the question often lingers: what does his life ask of us? It asks that we listen to God, to the quiet movements of grace within us, to the needs of others. It asks that we trust, even when the path ahead is veiled. It asks that we remain faithful in small things, knowing that the smallest act of love can ripple outward in ways we may never see. And it asks that we remember that the saints are not distant heroes, but companions, reminders that God works through human weakness, not in spite of it. In this way, Saint Charbel still walks among the suffering, not with words, but with presence, not with certainty, but with grace, not with brilliance, but with the same quiet humility that marked every moment of his earthly life. He remains a beacon for weary hearts, a refuge for the broken, a whisper of hope carried on the mountain air. And so his story returns to us again, inviting each soul to listen for the quiet call of grace.